Hey, everybody out there. Once again, we have Mark Collinsworth with us, the CIO of Vere Global Wealth Management, to talk about Kamala's proposals of economic recovery, including price controls and other suggestions, some of them which has already been out there by Trump, for which he's not giving them credit. But let's start with price controls, Mark. Now, surprisingly, even the liberal media, New York Times, Washington Post, have criticized her proposal for price control, saying they haven't worked and they won't work. It's a very bad idea. Why is that? Why is it a bad idea?
Thank you, Larry. It is actually probably the worst idea I think she's ever come up with. And the reason why on price controls, so let's look and see on food. Well, there's a cost to producing food. Gasoline input, labor, wages, all kinds of things that go into that. Not to mention supply and demand from changes in the weather. If let's say you put a price control, let's say the price of cotton can only be at let's say tomatoes can only be at the price of let's say $10. There's a drought, wipes out the tomato crop. Well, people that want tomatoes are going to be willing to pay more. Those companies that cannot raise the prices to compensate and reinvest it back into their business to grow those additional crops next year are going to have to file for bankruptcy. So essentially, you're driving more and more people out of the business because they cannot make a profit. You'll have numerous farms working at a loss. And eventually, if you run at a loss long enough, you go bankrupt, and that's just all it's you're going to have these food lines. And what's irritating is these tactics have been used in other countries before. The Soviet Union has implemented them. Venezuela has implemented them, and every one of them turned out to be just an absolute disaster. That's why the food lines were developed.
Well, even in 71, Richard Nixon imposed them for what, 90 days?
That was more due to the Vietnam War. And at the end of the 90 days, there's like, oh shoot, that's the worst idea we ever came up with. So again, I think all she's doing is she's trying to basically sell herself to the public because I can assure you the largest contributors to political campaigns are corporations. Corporations are not going to run their businesses at a loss, knowing that they're guaranteed to go bankrupt someday. Behind closed doors, I can bet you $100 they're telling her if you try to implement that, you will not be president.
So she's biting the hand that feeds her.
Correct. But behind closed doors, I mean, in public, she's probably saying that, but behind closed doors, she's probably telling those corporations, I'm just saying it to trick the voters into voting for me. I'll never do it. Because if she did it, some next election, you would see billions of dollars flowing into any candidate that promised they would repeal those price caps.
And, let's explain to the public who may not understand the intricacies of this. How would it lead to food lines, shortages on shelves, and higher prices ultimately? I mean,
Okay.
if you control prices, how does it result in higher prices and empty store shelves and a lot of food lines, gas lines, etc.? How does that happen?
Okay. Good question there. Let's say you're running a farm. It costs, the input cost, the price of gasoline goes up. There's a cost to move tomatoes from point A to point B. There's fertilizer costs. You have all these additional costs that go into actually growing or running a farm. If you have to put a price cap, let's say it costs you $9 to run the farm now. You basically sell your product at $10. That covers your cost, puts a little profit in your pocket. But let's say those input costs now go to, let's say, $20. The government says you can't charge anybody more than $11. Where does that $8 come from? It comes from either debt or going bankrupt.
Well, Mark, is there any validity to the argument that there is price gouging or gauging, as she.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I can prove it. This thing. So profit margins. So think about this. Profit margins in the United States have not gone up dramatically. Most of them have actually gone down for most companies. So let's give you an example. If you're making a product, it costs you $10 to make it, and you're selling it for $11. That's a 10% return. That is a 10% profit margin, right? Now, if you're still making that product at $10 and that price and you start selling it at $12, that's a 20% price margin. That right there is a markup. that could be a sign of price gouging there, but that's not what's happening here. Price was a You're paying a $1 in profit. The profit margins are coming down. That tells me companies are going out of their way to try to find ways to keep costs low, and to even to a degree, they're eating some of those costs. And it's basic math. If you cannot sit there, I can prove to you mathematically from corporate balance sheets that there's no price gouging going on. And what irritates me is she knows it. She's just trying to say it because the average person on the street doesn't understand even basic math or understand how supply and demand equations work.
All right, so Mark, are you maintaining that there is absolutely no price gouging in any industry in the
Oh,
U.S.
oh I, didn't,
Pandemic?
I didn't say there was any. There's going to be some people out there, but widespread stuff that she's talking about does not exist. I'm sure if I dug through thousands of corporate balance sheets, I could probably find some gouging out there. But right now, if I was to pick one just randomly, shoot, if I picked like 10 or 20 randomly right now, I seriously doubt I'd find any price gouging in their financial
Well,
statements.
she was talking especially about food prices and food operations.
Well, Larry, does she not understand that weather affects food prices? Think about this, Larry.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. Let's say you have a tomato farm. You're selling you sell 100 tomatoes per year at $1. That's $100 profit for you, right?
Hmm.
Right. Let's say it costs you $99 though to run your farm. So that gives you $1 of profit, right?
Hmm.
Let's say there's a drought and your crop gets wiped out and you can only produce 50 tomatoes that year. How are you going to close the gap between the 50 tomatoes that you used to sell and the 100 and the 50 that you got this year and the 100 that you sold last year? Where are you going to make up the difference between that because the weather wiped out 50% of your crop? Where are you going to make up the difference from?
Well, what strikes me also, Mark, is if this was ever instituted, uh, I don't know how you would stay on top of the situation, trying to figure. It'd have to be a giant government bureaucracy trying to figure out the cost of the product, the changes that affect the cost, and then the price that should be spelled out on the store shelves. I mean, that in itself seems totally impractical.
Oh, it is. And she's just saying that to try to get people to vote for her. If you vote for Kamala Harris because you like what she's saying about these price controls, that tells me one thing. You know absolutely nothing about basic math and basic supply and demand equations.
A lot of her economic message the other day, it reflected a lot of what Trump has already said, including no tax on tips. Now, how do you feel about that?
I think that's actually pretty good. You know, waiters and waitresses, that part of the industry has grown exponentially here in the last several years. I think it's actually a pretty good idea. I think where the big problem will actually come in with the tips is that's going to be a major hit to Social Security and Medicare taxes that are actually applied to those tips. So there needs to be a good way to plug that hole on the Social Security money that comes out. Even though Social Security is doomed to fail at some point anyway, you can't keep borrowing money every year and expect to stay in business.
Well, Trump has said specifically today, as a matter of fact, he was in, this is Saturday, he was in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. I reside in Pennsylvania. And he talked about, he again reiterated his promise that when he's president again, there will be no tax on Social Security. Now, is that a practical, workable suggestion?
Well, in the short term, yes. Long term, Social Security is doomed. You can't keep When Social Security was first established, I think there was like 7 people contributing for every one person pulling out. It's a great trade-off. Today, there's something like 5 people pulling out for every one person contributing. And you can't keep taking more money out than you're putting in. So Social Security is doomed. Right now, it's just riding on the coattails of government tricks and taxes.
Well, he said that there's so many, quote, there's so many other ways of making money in the United States that you don't need a tax on Social Security. If he's elected president, he'll get the economy roaring again. So there'll be plenty of
Well,
money to make up for what would be lacking from Social Security.
well, here's a great little question I'd like to pose to everyone listening. The IRS, or the income tax, was actually made into law in 1913. How did the United States government stay in business from 1913 to 1776?
So your point being what?
That the U.S. government for over 100 years was able to function, for almost 150 years, was able to function without an income tax. And
So
the way they made that money was through, tariffs. That was putting tariffs out there to keep the United States competitive, which is exactly what Trump wants to do.
so therefore, Trump's point is valid that you do not have to tax Social Security to keep the government in the black.
Correct. The U.S. government, there was no income tax prior to 1913. So ask all the people listening, how did the United States government operate if there was no income tax prior to 1913?
But
It
you're
came
also
down to tariffs.
but you're also saying at the same time that long term Social Security is doomed.
Correct. There's just no way that you can keep. There's just no way. There's a Larry. How much debt could you take on before you had to file bankruptcy?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the question.
Well, I mean, so what would replace it for seniors?
What they need to do is actually just get rid of the Social Security system altogether, and they need to sit there and say everybody after a certain threshold, let's say 50 years old or whatever, they won't contribute to Social Security anymore, and just slowly taper off.
Yeah, but I mean, what will replace an income in people's retirement years if Social Security is eliminated?
I think a great idea that's been proposed for decades is come up with a government 401(k) plan. Instead of 7% being pulled out of your paycheck every pay period, have that 7% go into a 401(k) plan or an IRA just for you. And that takes care of all the problems right there. It eliminates the Social Security Bureau. That's almost a $10 billion a year savings right there, just firing all those people.
And with a government 401(k) plan, yield just as much of a return as Social Security and be as stable and reliable.
It would actually be better because that 401(k) plan money would actually find its way into the stock market, which the stock market, as you know, long term has much better returns than bonds.
How about crashes? 29, crash of 29.
Well, well, that's what I'm glad you asked that also. That's why if you have a government 401(k) plan and whoever that person is, they need to go out and hire a financial advisor to make sure they have the right stocks in it. They have a diversified portfolio. So when a crash does occur, you don't take as big of a hit as the people that are gambling.
All right, but Mark, is that really practical for a lot of people that are not really savvy with how the economy works, how investments work? And I have to go out and hire a financial advisor, and then you've got to find the right one, the honest one that isn't going to be screwing you, right?
Well, yeah, but here's the problem. I don't think it's any better than what the government's currently doing. They take 7% out of your paycheck, and what do? They buy U.S. Treasury bonds. What do those U.S. Treasury bonds do? That's part of the money that goes and pays the Congress people and the senator paychecks, their salaries. So really, all your Social Security money doing is not being efficiently used to begin with.
No, but what I'm saying is with a Social Security check, the system now, you could rely on that check coming in every month and the amount being the same. If it goes in the stock market with a 401(k) and a financial advisor, if the stock market fluctuates drastically, then what happens? You lose your income. You lose that payment, or at least,
Eventually, Social Security is going to go bankrupt anyway. Again, you have things like I'll give you an example. I actually know a family where one of the parents actually died. They had several kids, and each one of those kids got to start tapping until they were 18. Got to start tapping into the dead spouse, the dead parents' Social Security. Well, there was three kids. Those three kids were like, 5, 6, and 7. They never contributed to Social Security, but they tapped into Social Security, three of them, for the next 15 years.
Trump also made a point that with all these migrants coming in, illegal immigrants, uh, they're going to overtax the Social Security system just by their sheer numbers. Is that the way it would actually happen?
That's correct because what's going to happen if you make those, because eventually they want to make those legal citizens that have never contributed to the Social Security program, but yet now are eligible to collect Social Security. Think
Yeah,
about that for a second.
yeah. Well, here's something else. The way the press has been covering it now, as I said at the beginning, the surprisingly, the Washington Post and the New York Times are criticizing price controls and her program. Now, here's a local newspaper, Scranton, Pennsylvania, which, by the way, is Joe Biden's hometown. If we could see this here,
Yep, yep.
the headline. And it soft pedals Kamala's statements about her plan. Throughout the article, there's no mention that Trump already proposed much of this, and there's no mention of the criticism about why it would not work. And at the very end, the last the line, it has Kamala uh, Trump's attack. Trump responded to her speech by posting on a social media account, Kamala will implement Soviet-style price controls. But other than that, the last line, there was no balance in the article about the pros and cons of her program. And that's typical of most of the news coverage of Kamala versus Trump.
Well, the best example I can give of that is look what happened in Venezuela. Venezuela, which is a socialist country on the borderline of being a communist country, it did the exact same thing that Kamala Harris is supposing. And look at what happened to Venezuela.
Yeah. So it's never worked, that price controls, right?
It's never worked. I mean, it basically forces companies to operate at losses, and if those companies operate at losses, eventually they go bankrupt, and it just makes the problem worse and worse and worse.
All right, final question. Do you think Kamala Harris was that dumb and didn't understand that price controls just won't work? Or do you think she was smart enough to realize it won't work and that was just for public consumption to get votes?
I think she's smart enough to know that it absolutely will not work. She's running on a campaign promise to promise it. And of course, also the thing you also got to remember, even though a president says something when they run, they have to get basically make it a law. You have to get 60 senators in the Senate to agree to it. And you've got to get what is it? 217 people in the House of Representatives to agree to it. And that's just not going to happen. And then she can always fall back because she's not going to try to make it happen. She can always fall back. You got to go out in your states and vote for more senators that approve for it. You got to go vote for more Democratic Congress people to approve for it. It'll never get passed. It's impossible. And if it did get passed, the country will be bankrupt within 10 years after it.
Who's going to win in November?
It's still land towards Kamala Harris
Because,
because of because the media is so biased towards her. I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. There's actually an article that came out in I think from CBS last week. It was saying Kamala Harris fighting for the weak work, the underprivileged workers to remove taxes from tips.
mhm.
Same day, article came out from CBS. Donald Trump imposes cutting taxes on tips. It will result in $10 billion shortfall in the United States government, increasing government debt.
Yeah, yeah, it's
So
the way the stories are slanted. Yeah. So you think because of the favorable and uneven media coverage favoring Kamala Harris over President Trump, she will win.
correct. Now, there are two things on the horizon that could displace her. One, you have all these things with the pro-Palestinian protests that are going on. You know, the pro-Palestinians have already put together a huge turnout to actually protest at the DNC that's coming up. If these protests get bigger and bigger and more violent, which they have, they started making arrests here a few days at some of them. That could be a major strike against her getting reelected. But the big one I'm looking at right now, the SOM indicator, which has 100% predictive ability on predicting recessions.
Explain what that is.
The SOM indicator, which was created by a Federal Reserve governor named Claudia Salm, the indicator basically says that if there's a 50 basis point increase, 50 basis points is a half a percent change in the 3 month moving average of the unemployment rate, that a recession will occur within the next 3 to 4 months. And it has out of the last 11 recessions that we've had, the SOM indicator has predicted all 11 of those 3 to 4 months before they actually started.
So therefore,
Therefore, the good news is we're probably going to be heading into a recession here at the end of October. Bad news is we might not be heading into a recession until after the election,
So
which
go ahead.
the recession would have to occur before, because the SOM indicator is about a 3 to 4 month predictability. Since it just flipped, the earliest that you can have a recession is basically at the 1st of November, is the earliest that you can have a recession, which is at the same time as the elections.
All right. So in other words, it wouldn't happen in time to help Trump.
Well, never say never. The thing is, even though the SOM indicator, so as you've seen, there's already been massive layoffs here in the last 2 or 3 weeks from companies. Cisco system is a massive layoffs. The more and more people that get laid off, I mean, recessions just don't occur. It takes several months. So the question is, do enough people lose their jobs between now and Super Tuesday to vote against Kamala? That's going to be the main question.
All right. So I guess we'll wait and see. And actually, we'll know fairly shortly now with the election in November. So
Yep.
Collinsworth, the Chief Investment Officer of Vere Global Wealth Management. Thanks once again for your expertise and your reflections on what's happening politically and what will happen, might happen, or should happen in November. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Remember, Larry, it's always the darkest before it gets really freaking bad.
Always a reassuring last remark from Mark. Okay,
Yep.
thanks.